Emma Lawson stood at the entrance of the sprawling mansion in the affluent Back Bay neighborhood of Boston. The historic brownstone, its exterior a blend of Victorian charm and modern luxury, belonged to the wealthy Hawthorne family, one of Boston's most influential old money dynasties. They were tied to the city's rich history in finance, real estate, and philanthropy, a family with roots stretching back to colonial times, yet they kept up with the rapid pulse of modern high society. Emma had never imagined she'd end up working in a place like this. A 25-year-old graduate from a community college just outside the city, she had hoped to pursue something more fulfilling. But the economy was tough, and after months of job hunting, she found herself taking a live-in housekeeping position, which promised good pay, free room and board, and access to a world she had only ever seen in magazines. The job seemed straightforward at first, dusting off antique furniture, polishing marble floors, tending to the laundry, and helping with the daily upkeep of the grand estate. But from her first day, she couldn't shake the eerie feeling that this house held secrets. The walls seemed to whisper, the corridors stretched on too long, and the family, well, they were peculiar. She adjusted her black uniform, tugged on her cleaning gloves, and glanced around the pristine foyer. Her reflection caught in the towering mirror by the door. She looked small and insignificant next to the opulence of the mansion, the high ceilings, the intricate moldings, the grand staircase that spiraled like a piece of art. "Emma, could you bring up some fresh towels to Mr. Hawthorne's study?" Mrs. Potts, the head housekeeper, interrupted her thoughts. "Yes, of course," Emma replied. She grabbed the pile of freshly laundered towels and made her way up the marble staircase, her footsteps muffled by the plush, thick carpet. At the top of the stairs, she paused. The house was quiet, too quiet. Most of the time, the Hawthornes seemed to be elsewhere. Mr. Nathaniel Hawthorne was a big-shot venture capitalist, always jet-setting across the globe for high-profile meetings. His wife, Elise, was a socialite, constantly hosting charity events and soirees, but she had become more reclusive in recent months. Emma knocked on the door to the study before cautiously stepping inside. Nathaniel Hawthorne sat behind a massive mahogany desk, his eyes fixed on his computer screen, the glow reflecting off his neatly pressed suit. He barely acknowledged Emma's presence. A man of few words, Nathaniel had the kind of presence that filled a room, but his cold demeanor made him feel distant, unreachable. "Your towels, sir," Emma said quietly, setting them down on a nearby chair. Nathaniel grunted in response, not looking up. But just as Emma turned to leave, she heard something, low voices coming from a speaker on his desk. She glanced at the screen. A Zoom meeting was open, but the participants' video feeds were all turned off. It was a strange scene, as if they were trying to keep the conversation private, even within the digital realm. "The shipments, too risky. Authorities might get wind of it." A voice crackled through the speakers. Emma felt a sudden jolt of anxiety. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the words were impossible to ignore. Shipments? Authorities? She quickly left the room before she could hear more, her heart racing. That night, Emma lay in her small room tucked away on the third floor of the mansion. It was far removed from the grandeur of the main living spaces. A tiny, simple room with a twin bed, a desk, and a window that looked out over the city skyline. But she couldn't sleep. The conversation she had overheard in Nathaniel's study played on a loop in her mind. Shipments, authorities, risky. What did it all mean? Was Nathaniel involved in something illegal? It wouldn't be the first time someone rich and powerful was caught up in shady dealings. But Emma knew she had to tread carefully. The Hawthornes were a powerful family, well-connected in Boston's social and political circles. If she started asking too many questions, she could find herself out of a job, or worse. The next morning, as she made her rounds through the mansion, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There were more visitors than usual, men in sharp suits, arriving in sleek black cars that lined the quiet cobblestone street outside the estate. They weren't the usual guests who came for charity dinners or cocktail parties. These men were different, harder, more secretive. That afternoon, while dusting the hallway outside Nathaniel's study, she caught a glimpse of a meeting in progress. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for Emma to see a man she didn't recognize sitting across from Nathaniel. He had a rugged look, his face etched with deep lines, and he wore a leather jacket, which seemed out of place among the polished marble and gold trim of the Hawthorne mansion. "We can't afford another mistake," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "If the feds get wind of this, it's over." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Everything is under control. We just need to stay quiet, keep everything off the radar." Emma froze. Her heart pounded as she realized the full weight of what was happening. This isn't just a small business deal. This is something much bigger, something illegal. She quickly moved away from the door before she could be seen. That evening, after the mansion had quieted down and the other housekeepers had retired to their rooms, Emma slipped downstairs. She had to know more. Her mind raced with possibilities. Was Nathaniel running some kind of smuggling ring? Drugs? Weapons? The possibilities were terrifying. She made her way to the study. It was empty now, the lights dimmed. Emma's fingers trembled as she reached for the sleek laptop Nathaniel had left on his desk. She hesitated. This was dangerous, invading his privacy, breaking his trust. But she had to know. The screen lit up, prompting her for a password. She froze, her mind racing. Of course, there was no way she could guess his password. But then she noticed something. A sticky note tucked under a stack of papers, 4 digits hastily scribbled. Emma entered the numbers. The laptop unlocked. She quickly navigated through the desktop, her eyes scanning for anything that could give her a clue. At first, there was nothing, just emails about business meetings and documents related to real estate transactions. But then, in a folder buried deep in the system, she found a series of encrypted files. Her heart raced as she opened one. The contents were a jumble of numbers and codes, meaningless to her at first. But as she scrolled through, she realized what she was looking at: shipping manifests. And they weren't just ordinary goods. The manifests were labeled with vague descriptions, but Emma recognized a few key terms: pharmaceuticals, restricted, untraceable. It wasn't drugs. It was something worse: illegal pharmaceuticals. Counterfeit medication. Emma's blood ran cold. She had uncovered something massive. Nathaniel was running a smuggling operation, bringing in illegal pharmaceuticals to sell on the black market. And with counterfeit drugs, people's lives were at stake. She snapped the laptop shut, her heart hammering in her chest. What had she gotten herself into? The next few days were a blur of tension and paranoia. Emma went about her duties as usual, but she felt like she was being watched. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone knew she had seen too much. Every time she passed Nathaniel in the halls, her heart skipped a beat. He seemed as calm and collected as ever, but now that she knew the truth, there was something unsettling about his demeanor. It was as if he was always one step ahead, always calculating, always in control. Emma knew she couldn't keep this to herself forever. She had to do something. But who could she trust? Going to the police seemed like the obvious choice, but what if they were in on it? Nathaniel had connections everywhere, people in high places who could easily sweep this under the rug. And then there was the fear of retaliation. If Nathaniel found out she knew, what would he do to silence her? Her thoughts turned to Mrs. Potts. The older woman had been working for the Hawthorns for decades, and though she was strict, she had always been kind to Emma. But Emma couldn't be sure if Mrs. Potts was aware of what was happening behind the scenes. Was she complicit? Or was she just as in the dark as Emma had been? One evening, as Emma was tidying up the kitchen, Mrs. Potts approached her. "Emma, dear, are you all right? You've been looking a bit pale lately," she said, her sharp eyes softened with concern. Emma hesitated. Should she confide in Mrs. Potts? She had to tell someone, but the fear of making the wrong move held her back. "I'm fine," Emma said, forcing a smile. "Just tired, I suppose." Mrs. Potts didn't seem convinced, but she didn't press further. Instead, she gave Emma a knowing look. "Be careful, Emma. This house has its secrets. It's best not to go looking for things you're not supposed to see." Emma's stomach dropped. Did Mrs. Potts know? Her cryptic words left Emma feeling more uneasy than ever. Later that night, unable to sleep, Emma decided to take a walk. The mansion's grounds were vast, with perfectly manicured gardens and tall iron gates that bordered the property. She walked along the stone path, the cool Boston air biting at her skin. As she neared the gate, something caught her eye. A black SUV idled just outside the gates, its headlights off. The sight sent a chill down her spine. It was the same type of vehicle she had seen those mysterious visitors arrive in. And now it was sitting there, in the dark, watching the mansion. Emma quickly turned and headed back toward the house, her pulse quickening. She didn't know what to do. Everything felt like a trap, like the walls were closing in on her. The next morning, as Emma served breakfast in the dining room, Nathaniel received a phone call. Emma tried to seem disinterested, but she couldn't help overhearing parts of the conversation. "Everything's moving according to plan," Nathaniel said into the phone, his voice calm and collected. "The shipment will be here by the end of the week. Just make sure the authorities stay out of it. I've taken care of the rest." Emma's heart raced. The end of the week? That was only a few days away. Whatever illegal shipment Nathaniel was involved in, it was happening soon. She had to act fast, but how? On the day the shipment was supposed to arrive, the mansion felt different. There was a tense energy in the air, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. Nathaniel was locked away in his study for most of the day, while Mrs. Potts went about her duties with a quiet efficiency that seemed almost mechanical. Emma knew she had to get out. She had to leave the mansion, go to the authorities, and blow the whistle on Nathaniel's operation. But she also knew she couldn't just walk out the front door. The men in the black SUVs were watching, and if they suspected she knew something, she'd never make it out of the city alive. She decided to wait until nightfall. Under the cover of darkness, she packed a small bag with her most essential belongings: her phone, some cash, and a few changes of clothes. She didn't know where she would go, but she knew she couldn't stay. As she crept through the darkened mansion, every creak of the floorboards sent a jolt of fear through her body. She could feel the weight of the mansion's secrets pressing down on her, suffocating her. The halls seemed longer, the shadows deeper. Just as she reached the front door, it opened, and Nathaniel stepped inside. Emma froze, her heart pounding in her ears. He looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "Going somewhere, Emma?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. Emma's mind raced. She couldn't lie to him. He would see right through her. But she couldn't tell him the truth either. Not yet. I needed some fresh air," she stammered. "I was just going for a walk." Nathaniel studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled. "Of course, it's a beautiful night for a walk. But be careful out there. You never know who might be watching." Emma nodded, forcing a smile before quickly stepping outside. The cool night air hit her like a slap, but it did little to calm her nerves. She walked down the path toward the gate, her bag clutched tightly in her hand. She had to get out of here, now. But as she neared the gate, the black SUV rolled forward, blocking her path. The window rolled down, and the man inside, one of the same men who had been at the mansion earlier in the week, looked at her with cold, calculating eyes. "Get in," he said, his voice low and menacing. Emma's heart stopped. She had no choice. She was trapped. Emma sat in the back of the SUV, her hands trembling in her lap. The man in the front seat said nothing as they drove through the empty streets of Boston. The city's familiar skyline loomed in the distance, but Emma felt a world away from safety. She knew she had made a mistake. She had underestimated Nathaniel and his reach. He had known all along that she was on to him. Now, she was at his mercy. But Emma wasn't ready to give up. She still had her phone, tucked away in her bag. If she could just find a way to call for help without the driver noticing. Her mind raced as she tried to come up with a plan. She needed to get out of the car, to find a way to escape. But how? The doors were locked, and the man in the front seat didn't seem like the type to let her go without a fight. Just as they crossed over the bridge into the Seaport district, Emma saw her chance. The driver slowed down as they approached a red light, and in that brief moment, Emma made her move. She yanked the door handle as hard as she could, throwing herself out of the car and onto the pavement. Pain shot through her as she hit the ground, but she didn't stop. She scrambled to her feet and ran, her heart pounding in her chest. The driver yelled after her, but she didn't look back. She ran through the streets, dodging cars and pedestrians, her lungs burning with every breath. She had to get to the police. She had to tell them everything. But as she rounded a corner, she collided with someone, hard. Emma stumbled back, gasping for air, only to look up and see a familiar face. It was Mrs. Potts. "Emma, what are you doing out here?" Mrs. Potts asked, her voice filled with genuine concern. Emma blinked, confused. "Mrs. Potts, how did you—" "I was worried about you," Mrs. Potts said, stepping closer. "I had a feeling something was wrong. Come with me, dear. We need to get you somewhere safe." Emma hesitated. She didn't know who to trust anymore. Mrs. Potts had always been kind to her, but now, could she really be trusted? Before Emma could respond, the black SUV came screeching around the corner, its headlights blinding her. The driver jumped out, his face twisted in anger. "Get in the car now," he demanded, his voice cold and menacing. Emma looked from the driver to Mrs. Potts, her heart racing. "I can't go back," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know too much." Mrs. Potts nodded, her expression grim. "I know, dear, but you're not alone in this. We can fix it. We just have to be smart about it." Emma's mind raced. Could Mrs. Potts really be on her side? Could she trust her? With no other option, Emma reluctantly followed Mrs. Potts. Together, they managed to evade the black SUV and its menacing driver, ducking into a narrow alleyway between two towering office buildings. Emma's breath came in shallow gasps as she leaned against the cold brick wall, her heart still pounding from the chase. "Mrs. Potts, what's happening? Why is this happening to me?" Emma asked, her voice trembling with fear. Mrs. Potts sighed, glancing around as if making sure no one was listening. "You got too close to something you shouldn't have, Emma. Something dangerous. But it's not too late. We can still fix this." "What do you mean?" Emma's mind raced, piecing together the events of the last few weeks. "You know what Nathaniel's doing, don't you?" Mrs. Potts hesitated, then nodded. "I've known for a while, but there's more to it than you realize. It's not just about money or power, it's about survival." Emma blinked, confused. "Survival? What are you talking about?" Mrs. Potts glanced at the shadows around them, then leaned in closer. "Nathaniel's not just smuggling counterfeit pharmaceuticals. He's involved in something much bigger. Something that could destroy lives if it falls into the wrong hands." "What is it?" Emma whispered, her stomach twisting in fear. Mrs. Potts's voice dropped to a near whisper. "It's not just counterfeit medication. It's experimental drugs, untested, dangerous, and illegal. They're using people as test subjects, Emma. People who have no idea what they're taking." Emma's blood ran cold. That's horrifying." Mrs. Potts nodded solemnly. "It is. And Nathaniel is willing to do anything to protect his operation. He has powerful friends, people who can make problems disappear. But I think we can still stop him. We just need proof." Emma swallowed hard, her heart racing. "Proof? How are we going to get that?" Mrs. Potts straightened, her eyes hardening with determination. "Nathaniel's been keeping files on everything, his shipments, his transactions, his experiments. If we can get those files to the authorities, we can take him down." Emma's mind raced. It was a dangerous plan, but it was the only one they had. "Okay," she said, her voice steady. "Let's do it." The plan was risky, but Emma and Mrs. Potts knew they had no choice. They had to get the files from Nathaniel's office and deliver them to the authorities before he realized what was happening. Late that night, while the mansion was quiet, Emma and Mrs. Potts crept into Nathaniel's study. Emma's hands shook as she booted up the computer, praying that the password still worked. She entered the digits she had found on the sticky note, and to her relief, the screen unlocked. Mrs. Potts quickly began searching for the files, her fingers flying across the keyboard. After what felt like an eternity, she found them, folders filled with documents detailing Nathaniel's entire operation. Shipping manifests, transaction records, and even reports on the experimental drugs. "This is it," Mrs. Potts whispered. "This is the proof we need." But just as Emma was about to download the files onto a USB drive, the door to the study burst open. Nathaniel stood in the doorway, his face twisted with rage. "What do you think you're doing?" he snarled, his voice cold and deadly. Emma froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Mrs. Potts stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "It's over, Nathaniel. We're taking these files to the authorities." Nathaniel's eyes darkened, and he took a step closer. "You really think you can stop me? You think anyone will believe you?" Mrs. Potts didn't flinch. "We have the proof, Nathaniel. It's over." Nathaniel's face twisted with fury, and for a moment, Emma thought he might attack. But before he could make a move, the sound of sirens filled the air outside the mansion. The police were here. Nathaniel's eyes widened in shock. You called the police?" Mrs. Potts nodded. "It's over, Nathaniel. There's nowhere to run." Nathaniel Hawthorne was arrested that night, his empire of illegal pharmaceuticals brought down by the very people who had once worked for him. The files Emma and Mrs. Potts had recovered provided the authorities with everything they needed to charge him with a laundry list of crimes: smuggling, fraud, and human experimentation. In the days that followed, the mansion felt eerily quiet, as if the weight of its dark secrets had finally been lifted. The other housekeepers packed up and left, while Mrs. Potts stayed behind to oversee the investigation. As for Emma, she returned to her life outside the mansion, but she would never forget what she had uncovered. The danger, the lies, the corruption, it had all been hidden beneath the surface of the luxurious world she had once admired. But now, she knew the truth. And though the memories of that time would haunt her for years to come, she also knew that she had done the right thing. She had stood up to a powerful man and helped bring him to justice. And in the end, that was enough. The maid who knew too much had found her voice, and in doing so, she had changed everything.